Thank you all for coming again. My name is Cindy Miller. My project is an examination of education gender gaps and development in the United States. I'm going to first go through a brief outline of what I'll be talking with you about today. I'll first go through a brief background of my project and what I'm actually looking into. I'll also go over a brief literature review with a theoretical and empirical framework with a discussion of data and some empirical results and a conclusion. So first, the basic research question I'm exploring is, do education gender gaps have a significant impact on economic development in the United States? And I just want to note in the beginning that I know that there are multiple factors that play a role into economic development. I'm using GDP per capita to measure the influence of my variables on economic development in the United States. And then it's also a really important question to policies, as it's going to help policymakers determine what areas they should focus on when they're implementing policies that are meant to improve economic development. Okay, so my brief literature review, I'll start with Classen and Lamana 2009, where they find that one gender gap leads to another. So for my project, if education gender gaps are decreasing, so they're getting better, if the size is decreasing, then that's going to lead to wage and employment gaps also decreasing and getting better. But it could be that education gaps are increasing and the size of the gap is getting wider, so then wage and employment gaps are also going to be getting wider. And then for Raunt 2015 finds that investments in human and physical capital are going to improve gender inequality overall, and that can be like government expenditures or individuals reallocating the resources to human and physical capital. And then last is Knowles et al., where they find that the less income, the wider the gender gaps. And they actually did a cross-country analysis, so they found that countries that had less income overall had wider gender gaps. So for my project, I'm doing a state-level analysis, so if a certain state has less GDP per capita, their gender gaps in education could be wider. And then overall, just this project fits with past literature by exploring how education gender gaps impact economic development at a state-level analysis. Moving on to my theoretical framework, it's really kind of confusing, so I broke it up into 3 different sections, and it's a flowchart. So the first section here is going to show how education gender gaps decreasing will improve economic development through labor force and productivity. So we first start with increased government expenditure on education. This is going to not only increase the quality of education we're getting, it's also going to allow for more people to become educated. And we assume here that with more people becoming educated, it's women that are being able to go in. So with more women being able to become educated, it's going to decrease the gender gaps. And again, that means the gaps are closing and getting better. And with the more women and the gender gaps decreasing, it's also going to decrease wage and employment, like we learned from Classen and Lamana 2009. And then with the employment gaps decreasing, that means we're having more people enter the labor force, so we're going to see an increase in the labor force. And that's also going to increase the labor productivity in the United States, which is going to increase GDP. And in my project, an increase in GDP is a signal that there's going to be improved economic development in the United States. The second chunk here is showing how decreasing education gender gaps are going to improve economic development through overall health. So again, we start with the increased government expenditure that are going to get more people into education, and that's going to decrease the education gender gaps with the assumption that more women are entering. And then while the current generation is entering and getting more education, they're going to take that knowledge and pass it down to their children and future generations. And while those generations are learning, they're learning more knowledge sooner about their basic health needs and everything that our parents are teaching us, that's going to increase the life expectancy from generation to generation. And also, while we're getting that knowledge faster and living longer, we're also going to be healthier. So we see a decrease in mortality rates, and overall that signifies that health is improving, and that improves economic development. And then the third section here is this red arrow that you can follow down. The red arrow is a little side story of how economic development can also increase through overall health when life expectancy is increasing. And that will increase when, so we're living longer and healthier, so we're going to be able to stay in the labor force longer, and that's also going to boost the labor force when more generations are entering while we're still in it. So then the labor force is going to increase, which is going to allow productivity to increase, and again GDP, which signifies improved economic development. So overall, in the theoretical framework, there's a lot of connecting parts that do get from gender gaps decreasing to improved economic development. And if for some reason, like, if this were all to be reversed, instead of improved economic development, we'd have economic development worsening. So moving on to my empirical framework, I chose to do an ordinary least squares regression that I modeled off of Farad 2015. He did a cross-country analysis as well, so I had to modify it just a little bit to make it a state-level analysis. But we do both have the GDP per capita as our dependent variable. And then I have life expectancy. EDU is the female-to-male ratio of secondary enrollment. MR is infant mortality rates. GOV is government expenditure on education. And POP is population. And then I do have some regional dummy variables, which I'm using just to see what the impact is on economic development across regions of the United States. And also for each of my independent variables, I predicted that they'll be positive in the results. So as they're increasing, they're also going to increase GDP. And then infant mortality rates are also going to only be increasing, or a positive result, if they're decreasing in the United States. So a little bit of a data discussion here. I did collect data from a variety of different sources, including the National Center of Education Statistics, the Center of Disease Control, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the U.S. Census Bureau, and the Measure of America. And with the data I collected, I did calculate some descriptive statistics, where we can see that on average, there's only a 1.060 female-to-male ratio across the United States in secondary education. And while this isn't a very large gap in education, in secondary education, I still expect there to be a significance in the results, as there's like a positive correlation between the female-to-male ratio and GDP per capita. And then also looking at the range of the government expenditure, it's really a high range, so I think this could be an explanation of why the quality of education is so different throughout the United States, and also with the GDP per capita and where individuals are allocating their resources. So like in the theory, we learned that if a country or state has less income, the education gaps are wider. So it could be that the states that have less income, government's not allocating as much as their expenditures to education, and that their income or their gender gaps are wider in that area as well. And then for my key empirical results, if you remember, I did predict that all of the coefficients would be positive, which was true for everything aside from population, which ended up being negative. And then of all the variation in GDP per capita, about 51% is explained with my data. And also just to note here, the coefficients are a bit misconceiving, as government expenditures, GOV, and population, POP, are significant, but they're really small. But when you're multiplying that in the equation, you're multiplying it by tens of thousands instead of like EDU, which has a very big coefficient, but you're multiplying that by like 1 to 2. So it's not going to have as much of an impact in the actual equation. And then focusing over to the regional dummy variables, we can see that the eastern region will impact GDP per capita the most, so we can conclude here that there are some differences in the economic development across the United States by region. And then focusing our attention on the most important variable, which is the EDU, again, that's the female-to-male ratio of secondary enrollment, and that's my education gender gap in this model. It's positive but not statistically significant, which I kind of find confusing myself, as it's so important in theory, and in past studies it's been really important to get other countries to improve their economic development. So I assume here that in the United States the education gender gaps in the secondary enrollment are just not big enough to have a significance, or education is important but the gaps aren't as important. And then I was also able to perform a counterfactual analysis where I examined what will happen to GDP per capita when there is an increase or decrease by a certain percent in the female-to-male ratio of secondary education. So the blue line here is the average, and that is what that's like with my actual calculated results. And then we have a 95% confidence interval, which the upper bound is the gray line and the lower bound is the orange line. And with the limitations of the confidence interval and the blue line being the exact opposite of what theory is telling us, then there really is no inferences, and that kind of makes the education, like gender gaps in secondary enrollment, less effective. Which leads me to my conclusion of education gender gaps are insignificant. And with that, to answer my question of whether or not education gender gaps do have a significant impact in the United States, the answer would be no, because there's no story with counterfactual analysis, and they're not statistically significant. But if policymakers were wanting to make policies to help improve economic development, they could focus on areas of health and wealth. So they could implement policies for governments to reallocate the resources more to education, or to other areas like health variables that are going to help us live longer and that will help improve economic development. And then I have a couple of potential next steps. I could explore different education variables. So instead of enrollment and looking at the number of people who are in secondary education, maybe look at attainment. However, I feel that the number who are in education now is a better measure, because with economic development, we already know that in the United States, to get to secondary education, you have already attained primary education, so you have that basic understanding. So if they attain secondary education, and with economic development, as long as you have some education, it's going to make a difference, rather than attaining higher levels. And then I could also explore other years. So here I just looked at 1 year, which was 2015, and I could either run separate regressions for like earlier year or a later year, and if that. Or I could do a panel series regression where I take the time series and all the years and all the states and then combine it together and run it at once. But for now, that is my project.
Thank you, Sydney. Do any of you have questions that you would like to ask?
I guess just a general question. Was there anything that kind of stood out to you as you were doing your research doing your research to answer this question?
Yeah, the one thing that stuck out to me as I was looking for, I guess when I was looking at the literature, I would look for like stories of education gender gaps in development, and there really wasn't very many state level analysis. It was more cross country, where they focused on like low developed or like developing countries instead of developed countries.
Anything else? Yes.
Okay, I just want some clarification about the education gender gaps are insignificant. Are we saying that that the education gender gaps are stagnating? Or are we saying that it has no effect on like whether you have secondary education or?
It's not like, so the secondary enrollment, that gender gap, it's either like the level of education that I chose to explore was not significant in the United States, or the gender gaps in that level of education are just not going to impact economic development.
Okay.
Okay. No, I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions, and maybe wonder maybe you have all of that in your project or paper. First is, why secondary? I know you explained some of it, but why secondary education, since secondary education is almost universal in the United States, and why not tertiary or higher education? Because I would expect that those effects in terms of wages and development would be more at that level. And also you might be able to see more variations across states in terms of tertiary. I mean, did you work with that, or did you just, the literature, maybe the cross-country literature probably focuses on secondary simply because they're looking at a subset of developing as well as developed countries. So
yeah, the past studies did use the secondary education, and I also read a different study that actually looked into what level of education is best, and they found that secondary education was best.
okay.
So that's also kind of why I chose secondary.
Okay, because, and my thought process was just that in some of these countries, tertiary education is so little that it's not. But when you're looking at the states of the United States, so what you really find is across states, those gender gaps in secondary education are not significantly associated with GDP per capita or at the state level. And I'm wondering whether tertiary education, and that's, you don't have to do it, it's just something that crossed my mind. The other thing is, did you try to control for factors like, or include variables like race or inequality in income distribution? Because some of those factors, a state like Minnesota has a more equal, the educational expenditures are more balanced, or if you just go to Wisconsin, there might be more inequalities as to how education is distributed.
Yeah, I didn't include other factors other than gender just because the model I was following didn't.
Okay, okay, great. And you also found that the dummy variable is significant in the East, and I'm hoping that you have some insight. I mean, it's pretty obvious probably why.
Yeah, it's something I didn't look into,
but maybe the literature says something as to why the East is better. But
yeah.
thank you, that was good. A lot of work.